My name is Daniel Morgan, and I grew up in a small town in Tennessee, not far from the Mississippi River. There was always something mysterious about the old graveyard near the riverbanks, a place known as Haven Hill Cemetery. Most of the locals kept their distance from it, especially after sunset. Strange occurrences had been whispered about for decades, from eerie lights floating through the trees to soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Haven Hill wasn't just any graveyard. It was old, dating back to the Civil War. Many of the graves were overgrown with vines and moss, their headstones worn smooth by time. Some claimed that the restless spirits of soldiers and townsfolk haunted the place, seeking peace they never found in life. As a kid, I heard the stories, but I never believed them, at least not until the night my friends and I ventured there. It was a chilly evening in late November. My friends James, Mark, and I were hanging out at Mark's place when the conversation turned to local legends. We had heard the stories about Haven Hill all our lives, but none of us had ever gone to check it out. Mark, always the adventurous one, suggested we go and see for ourselves if the place was as haunted as everyone said. At first, I wasn't sure. There was something about that cemetery that gave me the creeps, even though I didn't believe in ghosts. But James was eager to go, and before I knew it, we were heading toward Haven Hill, flashlights in hand. We reached the cemetery just as the last light of day was fading. The entrance was marked by an old, wrought iron gate, half covered in rust. Beyond it, the headstones stretched out in neat rows, disappearing into the darkness under the looming trees. A thick fog had begun to roll in from the river, making the place look even more eerie. We stepped through the gate, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the distant call of an owl. For a while it was just like any other cemetery, silent, still, and a little unsettling. But as we wandered deeper into the graveyard, things started to change. It began with a whisper. At first I thought I was imagining it. A faint voice, too soft to make out the words, carried on the wind. I stopped in my tracks, shining my flashlight around, but there was no one there. Just rows of headstones and the twisting branches of the trees above. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it." Mark, always the skeptic, shrugged it off. "It's just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound as confident as usual. We kept walking, but the whispers grew louder. It was as if dozens of voices were murmuring just out of earshot, their words indistinct but filled with a sense of urgency. My heart began to race, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving among the graves. It was quick, barely visible, but I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. I wasn't the only one who saw it either. "Did you see that?" James asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, trying to steady my breath. "Yeah, something's out there." We kept moving, our flashlights flickering as we went. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, swirling around us like it was alive. The whispers continued, growing louder with every step. They weren't just voices anymore. They sounded like they were speaking directly to us, urging us to leave. Suddenly, Mark stopped. "We need to get out of here," he said, his bravado gone. We turned to head back toward the entrance, but that's when we heard it, a soft, rustling sound behind us, like footsteps. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just shadows and fog. Then out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was a man, or at least it looked like one at first. He was tall and thin, his clothes tattered and dirty. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes... There was something wrong with his eyes. They were dark, hollow, as if they had seen things no living person should ever see. He didn't move, just stood there, watching us. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to warn us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my legs trembling. "Who are you?" Mark called out, his voice wavering. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly raised its hand, pointing toward the river. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to turn. In the distance, through the fog, I could see the faint glow of lanterns, bobbing up and down as if carried by invisible hands. My blood ran cold. Those lights weren't there before. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without a word, we turned and ran, sprinting back toward the entrance as fast as we could. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. I could hear footsteps behind us, closing in. but I didn't dare look back. By the time we reached the gate, I was gasping for breath. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road, far from the cemetery. Only then did we slow down, our hearts pounding in our chests. For a long time, none of us spoke. Finally, James broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. All I knew was that someone was in that graveyard, and whatever it was, it didn't want us there. I haven't been back to Haven Hill Cemetery since that night, and I don't plan to. But sometimes when I drive past it, I can't help but glance toward the hill where the graves lie hidden beneath the trees. And every now and then, in the distance, I swear I see those lanterns glowing in the fog, just like they did that night. I don't know what we encountered in that cemetery, whether it was a ghost, a spirit, or something else entirely. But I do know this. Haven Hill isn't just a place for the dead to rest. It's a place where something still lingers, something that watches and waits in the shadows. Lisa Evans was driving home late one night from a family gathering in the quiet town of Maple Ridge, Maine. The winding country roads were deserted, with only the occasional streetlight flickering in the distance. It was one of those chilly, fog-covered evenings where everything felt eerie. Even the trees lining the road seemed to loom larger than usual, their branches stretching out like fingers. As she navigated a sharp curve, Lisa caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. A small figure standing by the side of the road. Her heart skipped a beat. At first, she thought it was a deer or an animal, but as she drew closer, she realized it was a young boy no older than 10, standing alone in the cold. He was wearing what appeared to be an old-fashioned jacket, the kind kids would have worn decades ago. His dark hair was matted, and his face was pale, almost ghostly under the dim light. Lisa slowed the car, her mind racing with concern. What was a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere, at this hour, all alone? She pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down her window. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The boy didn't respond. He just stood there, staring blankly ahead, not even acknowledging her presence. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the way he was standing so still, so unnaturally calm, made her uneasy. "Do you live around here?" She tried again. "Are you lost?" This time the boy slowly turned his head toward her, his eyes meeting hers. His gaze was vacant, emotionless, but something about those eyes was deeply unsettling. They seemed too old for a child, as if they had seen things no one should ever witness. Against her better judgment, Lisa decided to step out of the car. She couldn't just leave him there, no matter how strange the situation seemed. She approached him cautiously, the gravel crunching under her feet. As she got closer, she noticed something odd. The boy's clothes looked worn, not just old-fashioned, but frayed, as if they had been through years of wear and tear. There were patches of dirt on his pants and a tear in his jacket. "Are you lost?" she asked again, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where's your family?" The boy remained silent. His eyes seemed to follow her every move, but his expression never changed. Lisa felt her anxiety rising, a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. She reached out to touch his shoulder, hoping to get his attention. But the moment her fingers brushed his jacket, a coldness unlike anything she had ever felt shot through her. It wasn't just the chilly night air. It was as if her hand had dipped into ice water, a deep, bone-chilling cold. She pulled her hand back in shock, staring at him. And then, without warning, the boy turned and started walking down the road. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, like he was following a path he had walked 1,000 times before. The fog seemed to thicken around him as he moved, swallowing him up until he was barely visible. Lisa hesitated. Part of her wanted to follow him, to make sure he was okay, but another part, the part that had felt that unnatural cold, told her to get back in the car and leave. Something about this boy wasn't right. She called out one last time, "Wait, where are you going?" The boy didn't answer. He just kept walking, disappearing into the fog. Lisa stood there for a moment, frozen with indecision, before finally turning back to her car. She got in, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm her racing heart. Maybe she should call the police, she thought. But what would she tell them? That she saw a strange boy on the side of the road who vanished into the fog. Deciding it was best to leave, Lisa started the car and drove off, her mind still replaying the strange encounter. She glanced in her rearview mirror a few times, half expecting to see the boy standing in the road behind her, but there was nothing, just the fog and the empty road stretching out behind her. For the next few days, Lisa couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Something about the whole experience gnawed at her, a lingering unease she couldn't shake. She started asking around town, trying to see if anyone knew of a missing child or if anyone had seen the boy, but no one seemed to know anything. It was as if the boy didn't exist. Then, one evening, she mentioned the incident to her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, who had lived in Maple Ridge for her entire life. When Lisa described the boy, his old-fashioned clothes, his pale face, Mrs. Callahan's expression changed. She grew quiet, her face growing pale as she listened. "You said he was wearing an old jacket and his hair was dark?" Mrs. Callahan asked slowly. Lisa nodded, confused by her reaction. "Yes, why? Do you know who he is?" Callahan took a deep breath before answering. "There's an old story about a boy who used to live in this town. His name was Thomas Jenkins, and he died on that very road over 50 years ago." Lisa's stomach dropped. "What? How did he die?" "He was walking home from school one foggy afternoon, and he was hit by a car. The driver never saw him through the fog, and by the time they found him, it was too late. He was buried in the town cemetery, but there's always been talk that his spirit still wanders that road. People say they've seen him, especially on foggy nights, standing by the side of the road, just like you described." A chill ran down Lisa's spine. "But that can't be. I saw him. He was real. He looked alive." Mrs. Callahan shook her head. "Many people have seen him over the years, but it's always the same. He never speaks, never interacts, just stares or walks away. Some believe he's still looking for his way home, trapped between this world and the next." Lisa sat there in stunned silence. The boy she had seen wasn't just lost, he was a ghost, a restless spirit from a tragic past. From that day on, Lisa avoided that road at night, especially when the fog rolled in. But she never forgot the boy with the pale face and old jacket, still wandering the road, searching for the home he would never reach. And sometimes, when the fog is thick and the air is cold, she wonders if she'll see him again, standing by the side of the road, waiting for someone to help him find his way. My name is Jason Miller, and I want to share a chilling story about an experience my uncle had in a small town in Louisiana, near the bayou. It was a warm summer evening when my uncle decided to take a stroll through the local park, known for its ancient oak trees and sprawling green spaces. One tree in particular stood out, a massive, gnarled oak that locals believed was haunted. Stories circulated about a ghost who lingered there, known as the Spirit of the Oak, said to be the restless soul of a young woman who had met a tragic end many years ago. As my uncle walked closer to the tree, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air around him grew still, and an eerie silence enveloped the area. Curious about the legends, he approached the tree to take a closer look. Its twisted branches loomed overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out the fading light. Suddenly, he noticed something unusual, a faint shimmering light emanating from the base of the tree. Intrigued, he leaned in closer. That's when he saw her, a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her hair cascading like dark waves over her shoulders. She seemed to be kneeling beside the tree, lost in thought, her expression melancholic. "Excuse me, are you all right?" my uncle called out, his voice shaking slightly. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with sorrow, and slowly extended her hand toward him. In that moment, my uncle felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over him. The air around him grew colder, and he could hear faint whispers as if the wind carried the echoes of lost voices. Compelled by a force he couldn't explain, he took a step closer. "Who are you?" he asked gently, hoping to understand her plight. The woman's lips moved, but no sound escaped. Instead, she pointed to the tree, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Suddenly, the ground beneath my uncle's feet shifted, and he stumbled back. When he looked up again, the woman had vanished, leaving only the soft rustling of leaves behind. My uncle stood there, heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. Determined to uncover the truth, he returned the next day, armed with a notebook to jot down everything he could find. After speaking with some locals, he learned that the tree was indeed tied to a tragic story. Decades ago, a young woman had been in love with a local man. On the night they were supposed to elope, a terrible storm hit, and she was tragically struck by lightning while trying to reach him. With each story he heard, my uncle felt the weight of the woman's sorrow deepening. He realized that she was trapped between worlds, yearning for closure and peace. That evening, he returned to the oak tree, this time with a bouquet of wildflowers and a small candle. Kneeling at the base of the tree, he lit the candle and whispered a few words of remembrance, offering his respects to the lost soul. He placed the flowers gently at the foot of the tree, hoping to bring her some comfort. As he stood there, he felt a gentle breeze brush against him, as if the very air was thanking him for acknowledging her pain. The whispers he had heard before grew faint, replaced by a profound sense of calm. From that day on, my uncle visited the tree regularly, sharing stories with friends and family about the spirit he had encountered. He learned to respect the stories of the past and the power they held in shaping the present. Years later, as he recounted the tale to me, he said he felt that by honoring the woman's memory, he had helped her find peace. The ancient oak, once feared, became a symbol of love lost and the enduring connection between the living and the departed. Had always been fascinated by old houses, so when she inherited her grandmother's Victorian-era home in a small town in Vermont, she was excited. The house was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown gardens and towering oak trees. It was the kind of place that held memories, secrets even, and Emma was eager to start a new chapter of her life in this family home. The house was everything she had hoped for, grand, full of character, and just a bit mysterious. It had been uninhabited for years, ever since her grandmother had passed, but it was in surprisingly good condition. There was only one part of the house Emma felt uneasy about: the attic. Her grandmother had always warned her never to go up there. When she was a child, her grandmother would say, "Emma, that attic is no place for children. There are things up there better left undisturbed." Now, as an adult, Emma wasn't so sure what her grandmother had meant. The house was hers, and she felt compelled to explore every corner, including the attic. She shrugged off her childhood fears and convinced herself that the stories her grandmother had told were just to keep her from poking around in dangerous old furniture or dusty boxes. However, the attic was still unsettling. Whenever Emma climbed the stairs toward the attic door, the air would grow heavier, colder. It was as though the house itself didn't want her to go up there. After a few days of settling into the house, Emma finally worked up the courage to venture into the attic. She climbed the creaky staircase, flashlight in hand, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. A wave of cold air hit her, sending a chill down her spine, but she pressed on. The attic was vast, filled with old trunks, furniture draped in white sheets, and dusty heirlooms from generations past. Sunlight filtered through the small window at the far end of the room, casting long shadows across the floor. Emma felt a strange sense of unease as she walked through the space, as if she were not alone. She began to explore, opening old trunks and sifting through family relics. There were faded photographs, handwritten letters, and antique clothes. It was like stepping into a time capsule. And then she found something strange. Tucked away in the corner, beneath an old wooden wardrobe, was a small, intricately carved box. It was beautiful, but something about it felt off. The carvings were unusual, almost disturbing, swirling patterns that seemed to move if she stared at them for too long. There was no lock, so Emma opened the box. Inside was a small, delicate pendant on a tarnished silver chain. It looked like it had been forgotten for decades. As she held the pendant in her hand, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. The temperature in the attic seemed to drop even further, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She put the pendant back in the box and quickly closed the lid. She felt an urge to leave the attic immediately, but as she turned to go, she heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. "Help me." Emma froze. The voice was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen, but the attic had fallen silent again. She turned back toward the box, her hands trembling. Had the voice come from inside the box? Or was it just her imagination playing tricks on her? Trying to shake off the fear, Emma hurried down the stairs and out of the attic, locking the door behind her. She told herself that it was just the wind or maybe the old house settling, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every gust of wind outside more ominous. She tossed and turned in bed, her mind replaying the moment in the attic over and over again. And then, just as she was starting to drift off, she heard it. Help. Me. The voice was louder this time, clearer. It was coming from above her, from the attic. Emma sat bolt upright in bed, her heart racing. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with fear. The voice continued, soft but insistent. Help me. Gathering her courage, Emma grabbed her flashlight and slowly made her way up the stairs. Her hands shook as she unlocked the attic door and stepped inside. The room was dark, the air cold and oppressive. She shined her flashlight around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw it. Standing near the small window at the far end of the attic was a figure, a woman dressed in a tattered white gown. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and full of sorrow. She stared at Emma, her lips moving silently as if pleading for help. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. As she drew nearer, Emma could hear the faint whisper again. Help. Me. The woman reached out her hand, and Emma saw that she was holding the pendant from the box, her ghostly fingers wrapped around it, clutching it tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Who are you? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she lifted the pendant, offering it to Emma. Her eyes were filled with desperation, as if she was begging for release, for peace. Emma hesitated, but something deep inside her told her to take the pendant. Slowly, she reached out and took it from the ghostly figure. The moment her fingers closed around it, the woman began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows of the attic. For a long moment, Emma stood there in the dark, clutching the pendant, her mind racing with what had just happened. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, as if the house itself had relaxed, its long-held tension released. The next morning, Emma researched the history of the house and discovered a tragic story. Decades ago, a young woman named Clara Davis had lived in the house. She had been engaged to a man who had died under mysterious circumstances just weeks before their wedding. Heartbroken, Clara had retreated to the attic, where she spent her final days in isolation. She had died in that very attic, clutching the pendant her fiancé had given her. It was said that Clara's spirit had never found peace, and some believed she still haunted the house, searching for a way to reunite with her lost love. Emma knew now that the pendant held the key to Clara's release. She had unknowingly disturbed the spirit when she found it, but by accepting it, she had given Clara the peace she had sought for so long. From that day forward, the house felt different. The cold, oppressive feeling that had once lingered in the attic was gone, replaced by a sense of warmth and tranquility. Emma knew that Clara had finally found her rest, but sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and the wind whispered through the trees, Emma could still hear it, the faintest of voices whispering softly, "Thank you." My name is Daniel Rivers, and I want to share a haunting tale that my grandmother often told me about an experience she had at an old chapel in a small town in West Virginia. Years ago, when she was a young woman, she and her friends decided to explore an abandoned chapel that was said to be haunted. It was a place steeped in local lore, known for the ghost of a bride who was tragically jilted on her wedding day. According to the legend, she had wandered the grounds, forever searching for her lost love, dressed in her white wedding gown. One warm summer evening, fueled by curiosity and a sense of adventure, my grandmother and her friends drove to the chapel. As they approached the crumbling structure, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the overgrown path that led to the entrance. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, but their excitement outweighed their fear. Inside, the chapel was eerie and beautiful, with stained glass windows casting ghostly colors across the dust-covered floor. My grandmother and her friends decided to split up to explore the different rooms, but they agreed to meet back in the main hall after a short while. As she wandered through the dimly lit corridors, my grandmother felt a chill run down her spine. The air grew colder, and she could hear whispers echoing off the walls. Just as she was about to turn back, she caught a glimpse of something white moving at the far end of the hallway. Curiosity piqued. She followed it, her heart racing with both fear and excitement. When she turned the corner, she was met with a breathtaking sight. There, standing in the fading light, was a figure in a beautiful white gown. The bride's hair flowed down her back, and her face was partially obscured by a veil. My grandmother froze, unable to take her eyes off the ethereal figure. The bride seemed to be gazing out of a window, lost in thought. "Hello?" my grandmother called out, her voice trembling slightly. The figure turned slowly, revealing a sorrowful expression. My grandmother felt a wave of sadness wash over her as the bride raised a hand, gesturing for her to come closer. Compelled by an unseen force, my grandmother took a step forward, but as she did, the bride began to fade into the air as if she were nothing more than mist. In that moment, my grandmother felt an overwhelming sense of loss and longing. She realized that the bride was trapped between worlds, eternally searching for her lost love. Heartbroken, my grandmother called out, "I'm here. What do you need?" The bride paused for a moment, looking back over her shoulder. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and my grandmother felt a deep connection, as if the bride was pleading for help to find peace. But just as quickly as she had appeared, the bride was gone, leaving only a lingering sense of sorrow in the air. Shaken, my grandmother returned to the main hall where her friends were waiting. They could see the change in her demeanor and urged her to share what had happened. As she recounted her encounter, her friends listened intently, their expressions a mix of fear and fascination. That night, they decided to leave the chapel, but my grandmother couldn't shake the feeling that she had to do something for the bride. She suggested they gather flowers from the nearby woods and place them by the chapel's entrance as a tribute to the lost soul. The following day, they returned with a bouquet of wildflowers and laid them gently at the chapel's threshold. My grandmother whispered a promise to the bride that she would remember her story and share it with others. From that day forward, the tale of the bride in white became a cherished memory, passed down through generations. My grandmother often spoke of that night, sharing how the encounter had left a profound mark on her soul. She believed that by acknowledging the bride's pain, they had helped ease her restless spirit, if only just a little. Though the chapel eventually crumbled away, the legend of the bride in white lived on, reminding everyone that love, even when lost, can resonate through time. And sometimes a simple act of kindness can help guide a lost soul home. My name is Sarah Bennett, and I grew up in a quiet suburb just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. For as long as I can remember, there's been a local legend about a grand old mansion that sits on top of a hill, looming over the town. The mansion, known as Hilltop Manor, has been abandoned for decades, yet it's the source of countless stories about ghosts and strange happenings. Everyone in town knows about Hilltop, but no one dares to go near it. Some say it's cursed. Others believe it's haunted by the restless spirits of those who once lived there. I never paid much attention to the rumors, at least not until last fall. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween, when my friends and I decided to explore the mansion. We were college seniors, home for a long weekend, and we wanted a thrill. My best friend, Emily, was always up for an adventure, and she suggested we go check out the place after dark. "There's nothing to be afraid of," she said, grinning. "It's just an old house." There were 4 of us, Emily, me, and our friends Josh and Taylor. We were curious but skeptical. Hilltop Manor had been boarded up for years, and we didn't expect to find much besides dust and cobwebs. But as we made our way up the winding path to the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The house was massive, with tall windows that seemed to stare down at us like eyes. The overgrown garden and rusted iron gate gave the place an eerie, forgotten look. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it open, inviting us in. We hesitated for a moment, standing on the cracked steps, but Emily pushed forward. "Come on," she said, her voice full of excitement. "Let's see what's inside." The inside of the mansion was just as creepy as the outside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked beneath our feet. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and broken furniture lay scattered in the rooms. But what struck me most was the silence. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. We wandered through the house, laughing nervously and making jokes to calm our nerves. But the deeper we went, the stranger things became. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I wasn't the only one. "Do you feel that?" Josh asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, we heard it, a faint sound coming from upstairs. It was like the distant echo of footsteps, slow and deliberate. We froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "Someone's here, Emily." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, but we couldn't see anyone. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced up the grand staircase, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. But the hallway above was empty. "Let's get out of here," Taylor said, his voice trembling. But Emily, always the fearless one, shook her head. "No way. We came here to explore, and I'm not leaving just because of some creepy noises." She started up the stairs before any of us could stop her. Reluctantly, we followed, the old wooden steps groaning beneath our weight. When we reached the second floor, we were greeted by a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The air felt colder here, and a strange smell lingered, like mildew and something rotten. We opened the first door on the left. It led into what must have once been a bedroom, but it was in complete disrepair. The windows were cracked, and the bed was nothing more than a pile of decaying wood and fabric. As we stepped inside, I noticed something odd, a mirror hanging on the wall. It was the only thing in the room that seemed untouched by time. The glass was spotless, and the frame gleamed as if it had been polished recently. I stared at my reflection, feeling uneasy, when suddenly the mirror fogged over, as though someone had breathed on it. And then words began to appear, slowly forming in the mist. "Get out!" We all saw it, clear as day. The words hung there in the mirror, and for a moment none of us moved. My throat tightened as panic surged through me. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. But just as we turned to go, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. Emily screamed, and we rushed to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if someone was holding it closed. Josh and Taylor pounded on the door, shouting for help, but there was no one to hear us. The footsteps started again, this time louder, echoing through the house. They were coming up the stairs, growing faster, more frantic, as if whoever or whatever was coming didn't want us to leave. The temperature plummeted, and the room grew darker, the shadows stretching across the walls. I could feel something, an overwhelming presence closing in on us. My breath came in short gasps, and my hands were trembling as I pounded on the door, desperate to escape. Just when I thought we were done for, the door flew open. We bolted out of the room, racing down the stairs without looking back. I could hear the footsteps behind us, chasing us, but I didn't dare turn around. We ran out of the house and down the hill, not stopping until we were back at the bottom of the path, gasping for breath. None of us spoke for a long time. We just stood there, staring up at the mansion, trying to make sense of what had happened. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "We shouldn't have gone in there," she whispered. We never spoke of that night again, at least not to anyone else. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about the words in the mirror, the footsteps, the door slamming shut. And I wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't gotten out when we did? Hilltop Manor still stands on that hill, its windows dark and empty, watching over the town. But now, whenever I pass by, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me back. Something that doesn't want to be disturbed. The Midnight Visitor. It was late November in a quiet town in northern Idaho. Michael Reed, a truck driver, was driving home with his wife, Rachel, and their teenage son, Sam, after visiting Rachel's family for Thanksgiving. The long stretch of road seemed endless, with nothing but the dark sky above and the barren fields on either side. Sam, sitting in the back seat, was dozing off when suddenly Rachel spotted someone on the side of the road, flagging them down. It was a man, drenched from head to toe as if he had been caught in a sudden downpour, though there hadn't been any rain that night. His clothes were ragged and his face, hidden under a baseball cap, was almost completely obscured by the shadows. "Should we stop?" Rachel asked, her voice uneasy. Michael slowed the car, unsure if they should. "Maybe he needs help," he muttered, pulling over to the side. The man approached, his movements stiff and awkward. Sam woke up just as the man reached the window, peering curiously at the stranger. The man leaned down, his face partially hidden by the brim of his cap. "Car broke down," he said in a low voice. "Mind giving me a lift to the nearest town? My place is just a mile ahead." Michael glanced at Rachel, who looked uncertain, then at Sam in the back seat, who had suddenly grown quiet. Sure. Get in," Michael said, unlocking the passenger door. The man hesitated for a second, then opened the door and sat down beside Michael, not saying a word. As they drove, Michael tried to make small talk, asking him where he was coming from and what happened to his car. The man's answers were short, vague. Something about his demeanor put Michael on edge. Sam leaned forward from the back seat, looking at the stranger with curiosity. He tried to lighten the mood by cracking a joke. "Hey, you don't have a body in your trunk, do you?" The man didn't laugh. He didn't even react. Instead, he just stared straight ahead, his fingers tapping rhythmically on his knee. The atmosphere in the car grew thick with tension. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Where exactly did you say your place was?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just a little further up," the man said, his voice now barely above a whisper. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally pointed to a small dirt road off the main highway. "Turn here," he instructed. Michael turned, following the narrow road deeper into the woods. The car's headlights illuminated the path, but beyond that, there was only darkness. Rachel glanced nervously at Michael. This was not a good idea. The road eventually led to an old, rundown farmhouse, barely visible in the moonlight. The man reached for the door handle, but before getting out, he turned to Michael, his face still hidden under the brim of his cap. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice now eerily calm. "You should leave now, and don't look back." Without another word, he stepped out of the car and disappeared into the shadows of the house. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. "Let's go," he said to Rachel and Sam, his voice shaking. He put the car in reverse, not daring to stay any longer than necessary. As they backed away, Michael's heart raced. He didn't look back at the farmhouse, but Sam, sitting in the back seat, couldn't resist. He turned his head, peering through the rear window. "Dad," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "He's standing there, in the window, watching us." Michael pressed down on the gas, speeding back toward the highway. No one spoke for the rest of the drive home. That night, none of them could sleep. The man's haunting presence lingered in their minds, especially Sam's. He couldn't shake the image of the stranger standing in the farmhouse window, staring after them. The next day, Michael decided to drive back along that road, determined to find out more about the man. But when he reached the dirt road, it wasn't there. The farmhouse was gone, as if it had never existed. Michael stopped the car, staring at the empty field where the house should have been. "Weird," he muttered to himself, trying to make sense of what had happened. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Something about that night had been wrong from the start. As he drove home, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something or someone not of this world, and he knew, without a doubt, that they had been lucky to get away. Sarah Thompson, a young professional living in Denver, Colorado, had recently moved into a new apartment in the heart of the city. It was an old, historic building with creaky wooden floors and ornate moldings. Charming, but a bit eerie at night. Sarah was attracted to the vintage architecture and the spacious layout, but she soon learned that this apartment had a long history, one that was hidden beneath its polished exterior. A few weeks after she moved in, Sarah started to notice strange things happening late at night. At first it was subtle, a light flickering here, the faint sound of footsteps above her when there shouldn't have been anyone there. She shrugged it off, assuming it was the quirks of an old building. After all, old pipes and creaky floors weren't unusual. But one night around midnight, something much more unnerving happened. Sarah was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone when she heard the distinct sound of someone walking down the hallway outside her bedroom. It was slow and deliberate, the floorboards groaning under the weight of each step. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the door, expecting it to creak open any second. But nothing happened. Silence settled over the apartment, thick and heavy. Sarah got up, cautiously walking to the door and opening it, but the hallway was empty. The strange thing was, she lived alone, and the building's security system was tight. No one should have been able to get in. A few nights later, things escalated. Sarah was having a late-night glass of wine and trying to unwind from a stressful day. The moonlight streamed in through the large windows, casting long shadows across the room. As she sat there, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the reflection of the window. She whipped her head around, and that's when she saw her, a woman standing at the far end of the room, near the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The woman was tall and striking, dressed in a red, floor-length gown that looked like it belonged to another era, something straight out of the 1920s. Her dark hair was styled in loose waves, and her face, though beautiful, held an expression of deep sadness. Sarah froze, gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. She blinked, and the woman was gone, vanished as quickly as she had appeared. But the eerie feeling in the air remained, and Sarah could still smell a faint, floral perfume that lingered in the room, a scent she hadn't noticed before. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued to see the woman. She would catch glimpses of her in mirrors, reflections, or out of the corner of her eye. The lady in the red dress never spoke or moved directly toward her. She just stood there watching, always with that same mournful expression. Sarah started to feel like she was losing her grip on reality. Was she imagining it? Was she seeing things? One night, after another unsettling encounter, Sarah decided to do some digging. She visited the local library and researched the history of her building. What she found sent chills down her spine. The building had once been a grand hotel in the 1920s, a hotspot for Denver's elite. But in 1927, a young woman named Margaret Davenport, the wife of a wealthy businessman, had tragically died in one of the hotel suites, Suite 303, which coincidentally was now Sarah's apartment. According to the old newspapers, Margaret had thrown a lavish party the night of her death. She had worn a stunning red gown, the same dress Sarah had seen in her visions. Margaret's death was shrouded in mystery. Some said she had taken her own life after discovering her husband's infidelity. Others whispered that she had been murdered in a fit of jealous rage. The truth was never fully uncovered, and her death remained one of Denver's unsolved mysteries. After learning this, Sarah became obsessed with Margaret's story. She read every article she could find, piecing together the tragic life of the woman who had once lived and died within the same walls. The sightings of Margaret became more frequent, and Sarah began to feel a deeper connection to the spirit, as if Margaret was trying to communicate with her, to tell her something. One particularly stormy night, Sarah woke up to the sound of soft crying. The room was cold, unnaturally cold, and the air felt thick with an oppressive presence. She sat up in bed, and there, at the foot of the bed, was Margaret, her face streaked with tears, her red gown glowing faintly in the dim light. Sarah felt a wave of sadness wash over her, almost as if the emotions of this long-dead woman were pouring into her. "Why are you here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. For the first time, Margaret's lips moved, but no sound came out. She raised a hand, pointing toward the window, her expression pleading, desperate. Sarah got up, drawn to the window by some invisible force. She looked down into the street below, and that's when she saw him, a man standing in the rain, staring up at her apartment. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face partially hidden by the brim of his hat, but even from that distance, Sarah could feel his eyes on her. A shiver ran down her spine. She closed the curtains quickly and turned back to Margaret, but the apparition was gone. The next day, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. She had read enough about hauntings to know that spirits with unfinished business often tried to communicate with the living. Margaret's death had been a mystery for nearly a century, and Sarah was beginning to believe that Margaret was showing her the truth. Determined to find answers, Sarah reached out to a local historian who specialized in unsolved crimes. Together, they uncovered new evidence about Margaret's husband, Jonathan Davenport, who had been suspected of foul play but had never been charged. Witnesses from the time had mentioned seeing a strange man outside the hotel the night Margaret died, a man who matched the description of the figure Sarah had seen in the street. With this new information, Sarah began to put the pieces together. She believed that Jonathan had hired someone to kill Margaret, covering up the crime as a suicide. And now, nearly 100 years later, Margaret's spirit was still trapped, seeking justice for her untimely death. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah decided to confront the spirit one last time. She lit candles around the apartment and sat in the center of the room, calling out to Margaret. "I know what happened to you," she said softly. "I know you were betrayed." The air grew cold, and the faint scent of floral perfume filled the room. Margaret appeared once more, her red gown billowing softly as she stood in front of Sarah, but this time her expression had changed. She no longer looked sad. There was a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "Rest now," Sarah whispered. "I'll make sure people know the truth." With that, Margaret's form began to fade, her outline growing fainter until she was gone, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of the past. The air in the apartment seemed lighter. The oppressive feeling lifted. Sarah stayed in the apartment for another year, but she never saw Margaret again. The haunting had ended, but Margaret Davenport's story would live on, thanks to Sarah's determination to uncover the truth. And every now and then, when the wind howls late at night, Sarah still thinks she hears the faint echo of a woman's voice, whispering a final thank you from beyond the grave. The Phantom Hitchhiker. Daniel Miller, a truck driver in his late 20s, had been on the road for years, navigating the vast highways that crisscrossed the United States. His job kept him away from home for long stretches, but he loved the freedom of the open road and the thrill of new adventures. Little did he know that one fateful night he would encounter something that would change his perception of the road forever. It was a chilly autumn evening, and Daniel was driving through the rural backroads of Kentucky after delivering a load in Lexington. The sun had set, leaving a crescent moon to illuminate the winding roads ahead. As he drove, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting eerie shadows across the highway. With his favorite classic rock station playing softly on the radio, he felt at ease, but that feeling would soon vanish. About 2 hours into his drive, Daniel noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a young woman, drenched in a long white dress that billowed around her like mist. Her hair hung loose, and she looked disheveled, as if she had just come from a party, but was now lost and alone. Daniel's heart went out to her. It was rare to see anyone out here in the middle of nowhere, especially a woman in such a state. He slowed down and rolled down his window. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The woman turned to him, her eyes wide and pleading. "Can you give me a ride? I need to get to Masonville," she replied, her voice trembling. Daniel looked at her closely. There was something unsettling about her demeanor, but he brushed it off as his imagination running wild. After all, he had seen his fair share of hitchhikers over the years. He waved her over, and she climbed into the passenger seat. "Thank you so much," she said, smiling faintly. "My name is Lila." "Nice to meet you, Lila. I'm Daniel. What are you doing out here all alone?" he asked as he merged back onto the highway. "I was at a party nearby, but I missed my ride home," she explained, her gaze fixed out the window. "I didn't think anyone would stop for me." They drove in silence for a while, the radio playing softly in the background. Daniel stole glances at Lila, noting her delicate features and the way the moonlight made her skin glow. But something felt off. The air around her was cool, too cool for a warm autumn night. "Where exactly in Masonville do you live?" Daniel finally asked, hoping to break the growing tension. "I live on Riverside Lane," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel frowned, trying to recall where that was. "I think I know where that is. It's not far from here." As they drove deeper into the night, Daniel felt increasingly uneasy. Lila had fallen silent, staring out the window as if lost in thought. He wanted to make conversation, but her demeanor kept him at bay. Suddenly, Lila spoke again, her voice heavy with emotion. "Do you believe in ghosts, Daniel?" she asked, her eyes glimmering in the low light. Ghosts? I've heard stories, but I've never seen one, he replied, chuckling nervously. Why do you ask? I used to live in Masonville, she said, her tone turning somber, but I died there. Daniel's heart raced. What do you mean you died? Leela turned to him, her expression haunting. I was in a car accident on the way home from a party just like the one I was at tonight. I didn't make it. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he glanced at Lila again. She was staring at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. I need you to take me home, she pleaded, her voice trembling. What do you mean? You just said, he stammered, unable to comprehend her words. I know I'm dead, she said, her voice a whisper. But I can't move on until someone knows my story. Please, take me to Riverside Lane. Against his better judgment, Daniel nodded. He felt a strange connection to her, as if he were meant to help her. They drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds coming from the tires rolling over the asphalt and the soft hum of the engine. Eventually, they arrived at Riverside Lane. Lila directed him to a quaint old house nestled at the end of the street. Its windows were dark, and the yard was overgrown, giving the place an abandoned feel. This is it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for bringing me home. Daniel parked the truck and turned to her, his heart pounding. Are you sure you want to get out? Lila nodded, a serene smile spreading across her face. I need to go. Thank you for listening. I hope you find peace on your journeys. As she opened the door, a gust of wind rushed through the cab, causing Daniel to shiver. He watched as Lila stepped out and walked toward the house. Just before she reached the door, she turned back to look at him one last time. Don't forget my story, she whispered before vanishing into thin air. Daniel's heart raced as he blinked, trying to process what had just happened. He scrambled out of the truck and rushed to the front door, but it was locked tight. He knocked frantically, but there was no response. Panic rising in his chest, he pulled out his phone and called the local police. I need help. I just dropped off a woman who said she died in a car accident, and I can't find her. The operator on the other end was confused, but assured him they would send someone to investigate. Daniel waited, his mind racing. He had just given a ride to a ghost. When the police arrived, Daniel explained everything, but they only found an empty house. The officers searched the area, but reported that no one had lived there for years. It turned out that Lila's car accident had occurred exactly where Daniel had picked her up, the very same spot. Over the next few days, Daniel couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. He researched Lila's story and discovered that the accident had been a local tragedy. A young woman with a bright future snuffed out too soon, leaving behind friends and family who had never fully healed from the loss. Determined to honor Lila's memory, Daniel wrote a detailed account of his encounter and shared it online, hoping to give her story the recognition it deserved. People began to respond, sharing their own ghost stories and experiences with the supernatural, igniting a dialogue about the unexplainable. Months later, as Daniel continued his travels, he would often think of Lila and the night they shared together. Her memory became a part of him, a reminder that there are stories left untold, and sometimes those who have passed on seek the living to help them find peace. Every time he drove down those quiet country roads, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, knowing he had helped a lost soul find her way home. And though he would never forget the eerie encounter, he also learned to embrace the mysteries of life and death that awaited him on the open road. My name is Jake Anderson, and I want to share a chilling tale my grandfather recounted to me about an experience he had while traveling through the back roads of rural Kentucky many years ago. It was a hot summer afternoon in the late 1960s when my grandfather, a young man at the time, decided to take a road trip across the countryside. He loved exploring the quiet towns and picturesque landscapes, often seeking out little-known spots that offered a glimpse into the past. On this particular day, he had planned to visit a small historical site rumored to be haunted. After driving for a few hours, he found himself on a narrow, winding road lined with towering trees and overgrown brush. The air was thick with the scent of summer, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. He was enjoying the peacefulness of the drive when, out of nowhere, a dense fog rolled in, obscuring his vision and making the atmosphere feel heavy and foreboding. As he continued driving, he felt an odd sensation that something was watching him. He brushed it off as his imagination playing tricks on him, but the feeling persisted. Suddenly, he noticed a flicker of movement in the fog ahead. Curious, he slowed down to get a better look. Emerging from the fog was a figure, a tall, thin creature with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. My grandfather's heart raced as he realized he was staring at something he couldn't quite comprehend. It had a ghostly, almost ethereal quality, as if it were partly transparent. The creature seemed to glide just above the ground, moving with an eerie grace that sent shivers down his spine. Frozen in place, my grandfather watched as the creature approached his car, its eyes locked onto his. It had a hauntingly sad expression, as if it were trapped between worlds. In that moment, he felt a wave of empathy wash over him, despite the terror of the situation. He recalled hearing stories about spirits that wandered the earth, searching for something lost, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was one of those souls. The creature reached out a hand, its fingers elongated and skeletal, and he felt an overwhelming urge to roll down the window and communicate with it. Gathering his courage, he finally managed to speak. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. To his surprise, the creature's expression softened, and it gestured toward the nearby woods. My grandfather felt an inexplicable connection, as if the creature was asking for help. He took a deep breath, trying to quell the fear rising within him. "I'll help you," he said, even though he had no idea what he could do. The creature nodded slowly, and without warning, it turned and began to float away into the misty forest. My grandfather instinctively followed, his curiosity overpowering his fear. He parked the car on the side of the road and stepped out, the fog swirling around him like a living entity. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew colder, and the light from the sun seemed to fade into a dim twilight. The creature led him to a clearing where the fog lifted just enough for him to see a weathered old tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted. It looked ancient, and my grandfather could sense a heavy energy surrounding it. He felt as if he were on sacred ground. Suddenly, the creature stopped and pointed to the base of the tree. My grandfather knelt down and began to dig through the leaves and dirt. To his astonishment, he uncovered an old locket, tarnished and buried beneath the roots. As he held it up, the creature's eyes glowed brighter, a look of gratitude washing over its spectral face. Realizing this locket must have been important to the creature in life, my grandfather felt a surge of determination. He promised to return it to a place where it would be cherished. He placed the locket in his pocket, and when he looked up again, the creature was gone. The fog began to dissipate, and the sun broke through the trees, casting a warm glow over the clearing. He felt a sense of peace wash over him, as if he had fulfilled a purpose. After that day, my grandfather never forgot his encounter. He often returned to that spot, leaving flowers and other trinkets as a tribute to the ghostly creature that had shared its sorrow with him. He believed that by acknowledging its presence and honoring its memory, he had helped a lost soul find some semblance of peace. Years later, he would tell this story to my family and me, reminding us that there are mysteries in the world we may never fully understand, but kindness and compassion can bridge the gap between the living and the lost. My name is Dylan Walker, and I've spent most of my life in the small rural town of Willow Creek, deep in the heart of Tennessee. There's a large park on the outskirts of town that's home to an old oak tree, massive and ancient. Locals have passed by it for generations, but no one dares linger near it after dark. The tree has a sinister reputation, one that's been whispered about since before I was born. They say something evil resides there. Some call it a spirit, others a demon. But around here, people just refer to it as the haunt. Stories of strange occurrences and unexplainable events around the tree have circulated for years. Disembodied whispers, the feeling of being watched, and, most chilling of all, the appearance of a shadowy figure that seems to emerge from the roots when the moon is high. I never believed any of it. I thought the stories were just local folklore, meant to scare kids from wandering too far into the woods. But that changed one summer night when I found out the truth the hard way. It was a hot July evening, and my friends and I were looking for something to do. The town doesn't offer much for entertainment, so we decided to hang out at the park like we often did when boredom struck. My best friend Evan had always been a bit of a thrill seeker, and he came up with the brilliant idea to go near the old oak tree. "Let's see if the stories are true," he said, his tone daring. "It's just an old tree. What's the worst that could happen?" There were 5 of us: Evan, me, and a few other buddies. We laughed nervously as we made our way to the edge of the park where the tree stood towering against the twilight sky, its branches spread wide, casting dark, spider-like shadows across the ground. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt. I don't know if it was the thick, humid air or the silence that had suddenly fallen over the park, but something didn't feel right. Still, I brushed it off. I didn't want to be the one who chickened out. We reached the tree and stood in a small circle beneath its massive canopy. For a while, nothing happened. We joked and teased each other about being scared of an old tree, our voices sounding a little too loud in the eerie stillness. But then, as we began to relax, something changed. It started with a low hum, almost like a faint buzzing sound, coming from the direction of the tree's trunk. We stopped talking, and in that moment of silence, we all heard it. Soft, but unmistakable, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind, and the whispering grew louder, like a voice just out of reach. It seemed to be coming from the tree itself, from the very bark and roots beneath us. Evan, always the bold one, took a few steps closer. "Hello," he called out as if expecting someone to answer. We watched as he leaned toward the base of the tree, squinting into the growing darkness. Then we saw it. A shadow, darker than the night around it, rising up from the roots. It had no form, no clear shape, but it moved, creeping upwards as if drawn by Evan's voice. The rest of us stood frozen, unable to process what we were seeing. Evan turned around, a confused look on his face, and that's when it happened. The shadow lunged. Evan screamed as something grabbed him, pulling him toward the tree. His arms flailed as he tried to break free, but whatever it was too strong. In the chaos, I could see the look of terror in his eyes, a raw panic I had never seen before. We ran. We didn't stop to help him, didn't try to fight whatever had him. We just ran as fast as we could, the screams echoing in our ears as we bolted through the park, not daring to look back. When we finally reached safety, gasping for breath, we realized Evan wasn't with us. We stood in silence, too afraid to go back. After what felt like hours, we called the police. A search was organized, but they found nothing. No trace of Evan, no evidence that he had ever been at the park. The town was shaken by his disappearance, but life moved on, as it always does. The park was declared off-limits at night, and the rumors about the tree only grew. Some say Evan still lingers there, another victim of the old oak's curse. Others believe that whatever took him was something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. As for me, I've never set foot in that park again. Sometimes late at night, I'll hear the faint sound of whispering when the wind blows, and I wonder if it's the same voice we heard that night. But I'll never know for sure, because I'm never going back to find out. The old oak tree still stands there today, casting its long shadows over Willow Creek. And while most people in town would rather forget what happened, there's a part of me that knows the truth. Something is waiting beneath those roots, something dark and hungry, and it's only a matter of time before it claims someone else. Just outside of Abilene, the small town of Anson is home to one of Texas' most mysterious and enduring ghostly phenomena, the Anson Lights. For decades, locals and visitors alike have been captivated by these unexplained glowing orbs that appear at night along a quiet stretch of country road. To experience the lights, you're instructed to drive east on US 180 until you reach the cemetery, then turn right onto a nearby country road. Continue driving until you reach a crossroad, then turn back around and face the direction you came. The final step is to turn off your engine and flash your headlights 3 times. Sure enough, as the legend promises, a strange glowing light will appear in the distance, hovering where moments earlier there was nothing but darkness. The most popular legend surrounding the Anson Lights is that they are the spirit of a grieving woman searching for her lost children. According to local lore, in the early 1900s, a woman sent her children out into the cold one evening, but they never returned. Distraught, she grabbed a lantern and wandered the area searching for them. It's said she continued looking for her children until the day she died, and her ghost has been seen ever since, still searching, her lantern glowing in the night. While many dismiss the lights as nothing more than car headlights or reflections, the sheer number of consistent sightings over the years has kept the legend alive. In the 1950s, several locals reported seeing the lights while returning home late at night, describing them as eerie, pulsating orbs that seemed to move along the road before fading into the darkness. In the 1980s, a group of college students from nearby Abilene drove out to see the lights and witnessed a glowing ball of light that followed their car for several minutes before disappearing. In 2005, a paranormal investigation team visited the site to capture the lights on film. They followed the same procedure, driving to the crossroads, flashing their headlights, and to their astonishment, a glowing orb appeared. Despite trying to debunk the phenomenon as light pollution or some natural cause, the investigators left without a clear explanation. Even locals who have lived near the cemetery for years are divided. Some claim they've seen the lights many times, while others believe it's an illusion caused by passing cars or atmospheric conditions. Yet, those who have experienced it firsthand, especially on nights when no cars are nearby, find it hard to dismiss as a simple trick of the eye. One farmer from the area reported seeing the light multiple times growing up and swore it wasn't coming from any car, especially since it seemed to float over fields where no road existed. Whether you believe the Anson lights are the spirit of a heartbroken mother or just a strange optical illusion, there's no denying the legend has endured for generations. The mystery continues to draw curious souls to the crossroads, eager to see for themselves the glowing light that has puzzled so many for decades. The library was never quiet, not really. Even when the lights dimmed and the air felt like it could press you flat against the bookshelves, there was always a hum, a whisper, maybe a heartbeat that pulsed through its endless corridors. People came and went, most of them with a purpose. They knew where they were going, what they were looking for. But then there were those who came for a different reason, the ones who weren't sure if they wanted to be found again. My job was to keep track of them all. Most days, it was easy. A few hours of wandering the stacks, checking on the shelves, listening to the murmurs of the watchers. They saw everything, but today things had gone wrong. Someone was missing. 6 hours. I had been searching for 6 hours, and not a single soul had checked out. It was unusual, worrying. Most of the time, if someone wandered off, I'd find them in a corner, nose deep in some obscure text, eyes glazed over as if they'd forgotten what the real world looked like. But this was different. This one had crossed the tape. The tape. The very thought of it made my stomach churn. Hazard tape, bright yellow, warning people to stay away. But this place, it was a maze, and the more forbidden something was, the more enticing it became. Some people couldn't resist. I had to go back to my desk to prepare. The broom closet was where I kept the necessary supplies for ventures beyond the tape. The helmet came first, heavy, old-fashioned, like something out of a deep-sea diving suit. I hated wearing it, but it was essential. There were things beyond the tape, things that shouldn't see my face. The light on the front of the helmet would help, but it was also a beacon, a signal that I was out there, moving through their territory. And some of them, well, they liked to play. Next was the sack, non-perishables, tinctures, aspirin. You wouldn't believe how many times I'd seen explorers driven to the brink of madness just by the pressure of this place. There was the compass, too, but it wasn't like any compass you'd find outside these walls. The needle didn't point north. It pointed to other things. Lastly, I strapped on the flamethrower. A small one, sure, but effective. You'd be surprised how often it came in handy. The creatures in the library didn't like fire. Most of them. I wasn't the librarian. I was just an assistant. But I had been doing this long enough to know how to survive beyond the tape. I only called for the head librarian if things got truly dire. And they hadn't. Not yet. The tape wasn't far, thank God. Sometimes it moved on its own, shifting deeper into the library, making my job harder. But today, the watchers had kept it in place. They knew I was coming. The air grew heavier as I approached, the lights dimming even further. I crouched, crawling beneath the crisscross of reflective strips, feeling the temperature drop. The tape wasn't just a warning. It was a boundary, a barrier between the library's known shelves and the rest. I felt the chill in my bones as I passed through, my lamp flickering as it illuminated the twisted spines of books on shelves that shouldn't be there. The watchers stopped here. Beyond the tape, there were only the listeners. I didn't like them as much. They didn't see, they only heard. It made things less predictable. I walked for what felt like hours, though I knew had only been a few minutes. Time was strange beyond the tape, stretching and warping, bending itself to the will of the library. I felt the familiar pressure building in my temples, the telltale sign that I was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a struggle as my vision blurred at the edges. I popped a couple of aspirin into my mouth, chewing them bitterly. I couldn't afford to lose focus now. My fingers tingled, and I knew I was getting close. The rocks at my feet shifted, rolling and tumbling toward a central point. Good. I was on the right path. I clicked the compass once, just to be sure, before stuffing it back into the sack. I didn't need it anymore. The breathing was the first thing I heard. Shallow, rasping, like someone was trying to pull air through a throat that had forgotten how. The rocks picked up speed, skittering ahead of me down a narrow aisle lined with books that hadn't been opened in decades. Their spines were cracked, their pages yellowed and curling, but they pulsed with life. I could feel it. Each step I took felt like it echoed 1,000 times over, reverberating through the empty space around me. There. In the distance, hunched over on the floor, was the lost soul I'd been searching for. A girl. Young. Maybe too young to understand what she'd gotten herself into. The book clung to her face like a leech, its pages fluttering against her skin as if it was breathing her in. Her body was thin, too thin, as though the life was being sucked out of her one page at a time. I approached slowly, carefully. The rocks were gathering around her, swirling in a strange, almost reverent dance. I felt a pang of sorrow for her. She hadn't meant to get lost here. None of them did. The book wasn't going to give her up easily. It never did. I pulled a vial from my belt, uncorking it with a sharp pop. The smell was faint, almost nothing, but the effect was immediate. The girl moaned softly as I poured a bit of the liquid onto the spine of the book. It shuddered, as if in pain, and the grip it had on her head loosened. I could hear its sorrow, its desperation. It didn't want to let her go, but it had no choice. "Come on," I murmured, knocking gently on the cover. "It's time to let go." With a final reluctant sigh, the book released its hold. I pulled it away, careful not to tear any more of her soul with it. The girl slumped against me, her eyes wide and empty, her skin cold. She wasn't all there yet. It would take time for her to recover, but she would. They always did, at least the ones I found in time. I carried her back, her limp body barely weighing anything at all. The dark closed in around us, but I didn't look back. I knew better. The library didn't like to be watched when it was rearranging itself. By the time we made it back to my desk, she was starting to breathe again. Real breaths this time, not the shallow wheezing I'd heard before. I laid her down on the couch, draping a blanket over her and setting the kettle on for tea. She would be fine. People like her always were. People like me? Well, we stayed lost forever. Jenny and her husband Tom had recently moved to a quiet, rural town in Maine. After years of living in the city, they were eager for a slower pace of life. Their new home sat on the edge of a serene lake, surrounded by thick woods, and it seemed like the perfect escape. It was an old colonial-style house with large windows overlooking the water, a long wooden dock, and a wraparound porch. It didn't take long for the couple to fall in love with their new place. The house was peaceful, with the sound of birds in the morning and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the lake. However, it wasn't long before Jenny began to feel uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. One afternoon, Jenny sat on the porch, enjoying the sunset. The lake shimmered in hues of orange and pink as the last rays of the sun stretched across the horizon. As she sat there, lost in thought, her eyes drifted to a figure standing at the far end of the dock. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He stood perfectly still, facing the water, dressed in a dark, old-fashioned suit. His presence was so out of place that Jenny blinked several times, thinking she must be imagining it. but the figure remained unmoving, its silhouette stark against the fading light. She called out to him, thinking maybe it was a neighbor she hadn't met yet. "Hello?" she shouted, her voice carrying over the still lake. The figure didn't respond, didn't even seem to acknowledge her. Feeling a shiver run down her spine, Jenny stood up and walked toward the dock. But by the time she reached it, the man was gone. Confused and unsettled, she glanced around, scanning the shoreline, but there was no sign of him. The lake was silent, with only the soft lapping of water against the dock. That night, she told Tom about the strange man. He laughed it off, teasing her that maybe it was a fisherman or a local out for a late evening stroll. But Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man had appeared so suddenly and vanished just as quickly. The next few days passed uneventfully, though Jenny couldn't stop thinking about the figure by the lake. She began spending more time indoors, only venturing out to the dock in the early mornings or afternoons, hoping to avoid any more unsettling encounters. A week later, Jenny saw him again. It was late in the evening, just after dusk, and she had been closing the curtains in the living room when she spotted the figure. He was standing at the end of the dock in the exact same spot as before, facing the water. This time, Jenny felt a surge of fear course through her. The way he stood there, so still, so silent, sent a cold chill down her spine. She called Tom over, her voice shaking. "He's there again, Tom. Look." Tom joined her by the window, but when he looked out, there was no one there. "I don't see anyone," he said, frowning. "But he was just there," Jenny insisted, her heart racing. "I saw him. He was standing right at the end of the dock." Tom tried to reassure her, suggesting it was just her imagination or a trick of the light. But Jenny knew what she had seen. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, set her on edge. She kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see the figure standing outside, watching her. A few days later, while Tom was at work, Jenny decided to take matters into her own hands. She grabbed her camera and went out to the dock, determined to prove to herself and to Tom that she wasn't imagining things. As she reached the end of the dock, the air felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. The water, usually calm and reflective, seemed unusually dark, almost like ink. Jenny stood there for a while, her camera ready, waiting for any sign of the mysterious figure. And then she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her skin prickled as she slowly turned her head, and there he was again. This time, the figure stood not at the end of the dock, but near the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. He was closer than before, and Jenny could make out more details. The old-fashioned suit, the unnaturally still posture, and the pale, almost glowing skin. Her heart pounded in her chest as she raised the camera, trying to steady her trembling hands. She snapped a photo, but when she looked down at the screen, the figure wasn't there. The clearing where he stood was empty in the photo. Frustrated and frightened, Jenny looked back up, but the man was gone. She hurried back inside, her hands shaking. When Tom returned home that evening, she showed him the photo, trying to explain what had happened. But the lack of evidence only made him more skeptical. "Jenny, it's probably just your nerves," Tom said gently. "Moving to a new place can be stressful. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't really there." But Jenny knew better. The man wasn't a figment of her imagination. He was real, and she could feel his presence growing stronger. Over the next few weeks, Jenny became more obsessed with the figure by the lake. She researched the history of the area, hoping to find some clue as to who or what he was. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. In the early 1900s, a man named Ethan Turner had lived in a cabin near the lake. He had been a recluse, rarely interacting with the townspeople, and was rumored to be involved in dark practices. One evening, his cabin had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances, and his body was never found. Some claimed he had perished in the fire, while others believed he had vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. But there were those who whispered that Ethan Turner's spirit still lingered by the lake, waiting for something or someone. Jenny's heart sank as she read through old newspaper clippings and town records. The figure she had been seeing matched the description of Ethan Turner, his old-fashioned clothing, his pale appearance. She realized that whatever haunted the lake had been there for over a century. That night, Jenny made a decision. She could no longer live in the house by the lake, knowing that the figure was always watching. She and Tom packed their bags and moved out the next day, leaving the haunting memories behind. But even after they had left, Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan Turner's spirit was still out there, waiting by the lake, watching for the next person to come along. And as they drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him, standing at the edge of the woods, watching their car disappear into the distance. The figure by the lake was not gone. It would never be gone. The Girl in the Mirror. Ravi had always been intrigued by his grandmother's house. It was a sprawling old estate, tucked away in a quiet town, surrounded by tall trees that cast shadows over its time-worn facade. The house had a certain charm, with its creaky wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and the faint scent of jasmine that always lingered in the air. But there was one part of the house that Ravi could never quite shake off: the antique mirror in the upstairs hallway. It wasn't just any mirror. It was massive, nearly as tall as the ceiling, framed in ornate dark wood, with intricate carvings of faces and animals that seemed to twist and writhe the longer you stared at them. The glass was foggy and distorted, making reflections look hazy, almost like they were behind a veil of mist. Ever since he was a child, his grandmother had warned him, "Never look into that mirror at night, Ravi. Some things don't belong in this world, and they tend to show themselves when you least expect it." He never understood what she meant and chalked it up to old superstitions, but something about her tone always gave him pause. As the years passed, the mirror became just another piece of the house's odd charm. His visits to the house were infrequent as he grew older, with school, friends, and city life occupying his time. But on one particular weekend, Ravi found himself back at his grandmother's house. She was recovering from a mild illness, and his parents had asked him to stay with her for a few days. The house seemed quieter than usual, perhaps because of the late hour, and after a long day of helping around, Ravi decided to settle in for a late-night movie marathon. He grabbed some snacks, curled up on the couch in the living room, and let the hours slip by as he lost himself in the flickering glow of the television. By the time the third movie ended, it was past midnight, and the house was plunged into a deep silence. Ravi yawned and stretched, deciding it was time to head upstairs to bed. As he made his way down the dark hallway, his steps slowed when he reached the spot where the mirror hung. In the dim light, the glass seemed darker than usual, the reflection murky and unclear. He felt an odd pull, something deep inside urging him to just take a quick look. "It's just a mirror," he muttered under his breath. He remembered his grandmother's warning, but it seemed silly now, an old woman's tale. Still, there was a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. His eyes darted to the mirror's surface, and for a moment nothing seemed out of the ordinary. His own tired face stared back at him. He was about to walk away when something strange caught his eye. His reflection didn't move. It was still looking directly at him, even though he had already started to turn away. Ravi stopped dead in his tracks, his heart racing. Slowly, he turned back to the mirror. His reflection was still there, but there was something wrong. Terribly wrong. His reflection's eyes were locked onto his, but the rest of its body seemed to twitch, almost as if it were struggling to maintain form. The skin in the reflection looked off, like it was rippling under some invisible force. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again, hoping it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But this time, the reflection did something that froze the blood in his veins. It smiled. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across its face, one that didn't match the terror Ravi felt rising in his chest. The reflection lifted a hand and waved, but its movement was slow, jerky, and grotesque, as though its arm was being forced to move by something else. Ravi stumbled backward, his breath quickening. The air in the hallway seemed to grow colder, and a faint humming sound began to fill his ears. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the mirror. His reflection's eyes, though still fixed on his, had begun to darken, turning a deep, soulless black. And then, as if the mirror had come alive, the reflection's hand reached out. The glass rippled like water, and the pale hand emerged from the mirror, inching toward Ravi. He could feel the cold radiating from it, an unnatural chill that sent shivers down his spine. Panicked, Ravi turned and bolted down the hallway, racing to his bedroom. His heart pounded in his chest as he slammed the door shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. He pressed his back against the door, breathing heavily, trying to convince himself that it was all just a dream, a hallucination from lack of sleep. But the soft whispers outside his door told him otherwise. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his ragged breathing. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder, clearer. It was a voice, a woman's voice, calling his name. "Ravi, come back! Ravi?" The sound was coming from the hallway. He could feel the icy presence growing stronger, creeping under the door. The whispers became more insistent, more urgent. "Ravi, please, I just want to talk." The air in the room grew colder, and Ravi's breath began to fog in front of him. He backed away from the door, his eyes wide with fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever was in that mirror, wasn't just trying to scare him. It was trying to reach him. Desperate, Ravi ran to the window, contemplating whether to climb out and flee, but the second-story drop was too high. He was trapped. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, though in reality it was only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, if they stopped, the room fell into an eerie silence. Ravi stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was only silence. Cautiously, he crept back to the door and pressed his ear against it. Nothing. Summoning all his courage, he slowly unlocked the door and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. The mirror stood at the far end, its surface now clear and still, reflecting nothing but the dim light of the hallway. Ravi shut the door again and spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching a blanket and watching the door. The next morning, he wasted no time asking his grandmother about the mirror. Her face turned pale, and she quietly led him to the kitchen, away from the prying ears of the house. "The mirror belonged to the family that lived here before us," she explained in a low voice. "There was a girl, about your age, who disappeared one night. She was last seen playing in front of that mirror. After she vanished, strange things started happening in the house. They say her spirit became trapped inside it." Ravi stared at his grandmother, the weight of her words sinking in. He couldn't shake the image of that pale hand reaching for him, or the eerie smile on his reflection's face. "I've told you never to look into it at night," his grandmother continued. "Some things are best left alone. The mirror, it shows things that don't belong in this world." Ravi never looked into the mirror again, but every time he visited the house after that, he could feel its presence, like it was watching him, waiting for another chance to show him what lay on the other side. The Haunted Cabin. Jessica Harper, a spirited and adventurous woman in her 30s, had always dreamed of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life in New York. Tired of the relentless pace and constant noise, she decided to spend a long weekend in a remote cabin nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. The cabin belonged to her late grandfather, a man she had fond memories of during her childhood. It had been years since she last visited, and she yearned to reconnect with her roots. As Jessica packed her car with supplies, she felt a sense of excitement bubbling inside her. The idea of immersing herself in nature surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of wildlife thrilled her. She drove for hours, following winding roads that led her deeper into the mountains. The sunlight began to fade as she approached the cabin, casting long shadows across the landscape. When she finally arrived, the cabin stood as she remembered. A quaint wooden structure with a rustic charm, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, creating a soothing melody that welcomed her. Jessica stepped out of her car, breathing in the crisp mountain air, and felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. Inside, the cabin was just as she recalled. The worn wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the faint smell of pine lingered in the air. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the windows. She settled in, lighting a fire in the old stone fireplace to ward off the evening chill, and began unpacking her things. As night fell, Jessica settled into a cozy armchair with a mug of hot cocoa, the crackling fire providing warmth and comfort. But as the fire flickered, she felt an unsettling presence in the cabin. The air grew heavy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shaking off her unease, Jessica reminded herself that the cabin was simply old and creaky. She grabbed her laptop to do some work, but the strange sensation lingered. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of leaves outside made her jump. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Jessica heard a soft whispering sound coming from the other room. Her heart raced, and she stood frozen for a moment. The cabin had no electricity, and the only light came from the fire. With a mix of curiosity and trepidation, she tiptoed toward the source of the sound. As she entered the living room, the whispering faded, but she noticed something peculiar. A family photo hanging on the wall had shifted, tilting slightly to the left. She felt an inexplicable urge to adjust it, but as she reached out, a sudden chill swept through the room, sending shivers down her spine. "I must be tired," she muttered to herself, trying to rationalize the strange occurrences. She returned to her bedroom, but sleep eluded her. The feeling of being watched intensified, and shadows seemed to dance across the walls. Finally, exhaustion took over, and she drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, Jessica woke to the sun filtering through the window, dispelling the remnants of her anxiety. Determined to enjoy her getaway, she spent the day hiking through the beautiful trails surrounding the cabin. But every time she returned, the unease would creep back in, like an unwelcome guest. As night fell again, Jessica decided to confront her fears. She lit candles around the cabin, hoping to create a more inviting atmosphere. Settling down with a book, she felt a surge of courage. But as she read, the temperature dropped suddenly, and she heard a distinct knock on the door. Her heart raced as she glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Summoning her courage, she stood up and opened the door, perhaps, but no one was there. The forest stood silent, shrouded in darkness. Returning inside, Jessica noticed the air felt thicker, and she could hear faint whispers again. This time, they were clearer. "Help us! Help us!" The voices seemed to be pleading, echoing through the walls. Panic gripped her, but she knew she couldn't let fear control her. She grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. "Who's there?" she called into the darkness. "What do you want?" To her astonishment, a figure materialized in front of her. A translucent woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing with sorrowful eyes that bore into her soul. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the ghostly figure reached out, gesturing for her to follow. With her heart pounding, Jessica hesitated but felt an inexplicable pull toward the spirit. She followed the apparition into the woods, the whispers growing louder with every step. The woman led her to a clearing where the moonlight illuminated an old, crumbling stone well. The spirit pointed down into the well, her eyes filled with desperation. Jessica felt a rush of understanding. This ghost was trying to communicate something important. "I'm here to help you," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "What do you need?" The ghostly woman's expression softened, and for a fleeting moment, Jessica felt a deep connection, as if she were channeling the spirit's pain. "My children, they were lost here long ago," the spirit whispered, her voice barely audible. Jessica realized the well was a grave marker of sorts. Legends spoke of a family that had vanished in these woods years ago, their tragic tale buried in local lore. The spirit was seeking closure, a way to find peace and let go of her grief. "I'll find them," Jessica promised, her voice firm. "I'll tell their story." As she spoke, the ghostly figure began to fade, a serene smile appearing on her lips. "Thank you, thank you." The next day, Jessica spent hours researching the local history, uncovering the tragic tale of the family who had once lived in her grandfather's cabin. The children had fallen into the well, and their mother had searched for them until her last breath. With her newfound knowledge, Jessica decided to honor their memory. Back at the cabin, she gathered stones and flowers and created a small memorial by the well. She spent hours writing their story, detailing their lives and the tragedy that had befallen them. As she placed the stones around the well, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. From that moment on, the oppressive presence in the cabin lifted. The whispers turned into a gentle breeze, and the shadows receded. Jessica felt a warm energy envelop her, a sign that the spirits had found solace. As she packed her car to leave, she looked back at the cabin with gratitude. It had been a weekend filled with fear, but ultimately it became a journey of healing for her and the spirits trapped within those walls. Jessica promised herself she would return to visit, not just to escape, but to remember and honor the lost souls who had guided her on this unexpected adventure. With a smile on her face and a sense of purpose in her heart, she drove away, knowing she had forged a connection that transcended time, helping spirits find peace while reclaiming her own. The mountains loomed behind her, standing tall and silent, guardians of the secrets they held as she set off into a bright new future. The Whispering Woman on the Road. Rahul and his group of friends had been driving for hours, their weekend trip to the hill station drawing to a close. It was late, far later than they had planned to be on the road, but they had lingered at their campsite, laughing and sharing stories around the fire. Now, the air inside the car was thick with exhaustion, the glow of the dashboard the only light on the narrow, winding road that stretched ahead of them like a dark ribbon. The road they had chosen to take back to the city was notorious among the locals, often referred to as the Whispering Road. It was an old highway that snaked through dense forests and overgrown hills. Few people used it anymore, as it had gained a reputation for being haunted. Stories of ghostly encounters and strange occurrences abounded, whispered in hushed tones by those who dared to share them. Rahul had heard some of those stories before, tales of strange apparitions, shadowy figures appearing out of nowhere, and voices in the night. But, like many, he had dismissed them as just another piece of local folklore, until that night. As they drove deeper into the forest, the mood in the car grew quieter. The lively chatter from earlier had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. The trees outside loomed tall and menacing, their branches like skeletal fingers stretching out over the road. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows that flickered and danced at the edges of their vision. Rahul glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight, and the forest seemed unnervingly still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the hum of the engine and the occasional bump as the car rolled over cracks in the weathered asphalt. "Man, this road is giving me the creeps," Mehul, sitting in the passenger seat, muttered, breaking the silence. "Feels like we're the only ones out here." Rahul chuckled, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "Relax, it's just an old road. We'll be home before you know it." But even he didn't fully believe his own words. Suddenly, up ahead, something caught his eye. At first, it was just a faint shape in the distance, barely visible in the dim light of the headlights. As they drove closer, the shape became clearer, and Rahul's heart skipped a beat. A woman stood at the side of the road. She was dressed in white, an old-fashioned sari by the looks of it. Her long black hair was tangled and hung loose over her shoulders, and she appeared to be barefoot. The way she stood, so still and quiet, sent a chill down Rahul's spine. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, but it was her eyes, wide, hollow, and unblinking, that unsettled him the most. "Whoa, what the hell is she doing out here?" Mehul asked, his voice now tinged with apprehension. "Should we stop?" One of their friends, Ria, whispered from the back seat, sounding uneasy. "Maybe she needs help." Rahul hesitated, his foot hovering over the brake. Something inside him screamed not to stop, not to engage, but at the same time he couldn't shake the feeling that they couldn't just leave her there. Against his better judgment, he slowly brought the car to a stop a few feet from the woman. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching them. Rahul rolled down the window slightly, enough to call out, "Do you need help, ma'am? Are you okay?" The woman turned her head slowly toward him, her face expressionless, her lips parted, and in a soft, almost whispering voice, she said, "Can you take me home? Please, I need to get home." Her voice sent a shiver down Rahul's spine. There was something off about the way she spoke, as if the words didn't quite belong to her. But before he could say anything, Mehul leaned out of the window and asked, "Where do you live? We can give you a ride." The woman stepped forward and slowly opened the back door of the car. She slid into the seat next to Ria without saying a word. Ria scooted over, clearly uncomfortable but trying not to show it. As they started driving again, the tension in the car was palpable. Rahul tried to focus on the road, but he couldn't help glancing at the woman in the rearview mirror. She sat completely still, staring straight ahead, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't speak, didn't blink. It was as though she wasn't really there. "So where exactly is your house?" Rahul asked, breaking the silence. For a moment there was no response. Then, in the same eerie whisper, she said, "Just up ahead, on the left." They continued driving, but as they passed bend after bend, there was no house in sight. The trees on either side of the road grew denser, and the darkness seemed to press in on them heavier than before. Minutes ticked by, and the sense of dread in the car grew. Mehul turned around in his seat and said, "Are you sure we're going the right way? We haven't seen any houses for miles." The woman didn't respond. She just sat there, staring ahead. Rahul's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. Something was wrong, very wrong. His heart pounded in his chest, and his instincts screamed at him to stop the car, to get out, to run. But he couldn't. He felt trapped, as if the very road was pulling them deeper into something they couldn't escape. "Hey," Ria whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's not right." "She's not." "Ah." Before she could finish her sentence, the woman finally turned her head toward Rahul, locking eyes with him in the rearview mirror. Her face, once pale, now seemed distorted. Her features stretched, her eyes sunken and dark. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide for her face. And then she whispered again, "I need to get home." That was when Rahul saw it. The back seat was empty. The woman had vanished. She was gone. "Stop the car!" Mehul shouted, his voice filled with panic. Rahul slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. They all jumped out, their breaths ragged, hearts racing. The night air was cold, and they stood in stunned silence, staring at the empty back seat. There was no trace of the woman. No footprints, no sign that she had ever been there. The road stretched behind them, empty and dark, and in the distance the faint sound of whispers floated on the wind, growing louder with each passing second. "Did you hear that?" Ria asked, her voice shaking. They all nodded, too terrified to speak. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Rahul saw movement, something pale darting between the trees at the edge of the road. His heart pounded in his chest, and he stepped back, his legs trembling. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, surrounding them from all sides. "We need to go. Now," Mehul said, his voice barely a whisper. Without another word, they scrambled back into the car. Rahul floored the accelerator, and the car sped down the road, the shadows of the forest closing in behind them. The whispers faded into the distance, but the fear lingered. When they finally reached a small roadside dhaba, they pulled over, shaken and pale. They huddled together inside, ordering tea to calm their nerves. As they sat down, the old man behind the counter noticed their distressed faces and asked what had happened. Reluctantly, Rahul told him about the woman. The old man's face darkened. "You've seen her," he said in a low, somber voice. "She died on that road many years ago. A terrible accident. Her body was found in a ditch, but her spirit still wanders, trying to get home. Many travelers have seen her. She always asks for a ride, but she never stays long. She disappears before she can reach her destination." Rahul and his friends exchanged horrified glances. They had heard of such stories before, but never believed they could be true, until that night. As they left the dhaba and got back on the road, they couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still with them, watching from the shadows, waiting for her next chance to find a way home. My name is Jason Miller, and I want to share a chilling story about an experience my uncle had in a small town in Louisiana, near the bayou. It was a warm summer evening when my uncle decided to take a stroll through the local park, known for its ancient oak trees and sprawling green spaces. One tree in particular stood out, a massive, gnarled oak that locals believed was haunted. Stories circulated about a ghost who lingered there, known as the Spirit of the Oak, said to be the restless soul of a young woman who had met a tragic end many years ago. As my uncle walked closer to the tree, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air around him grew still, and an eerie silence enveloped the area. Curious about the legends, he approached the tree to take a closer look. Its twisted branches loomed overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out the fading light. Suddenly, he noticed something unusual, a faint shimmering light emanating from the base of the tree. Intrigued, he leaned in closer. That's when he saw her, a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her hair cascading like dark waves over her shoulders. She seemed to be kneeling beside the tree, lost in thought, her expression melancholic. "Excuse me, are you all right?" my uncle called out, his voice shaking slightly. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with sorrow, and slowly extended her hand toward him. In that moment, my uncle felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over him. The air around him grew colder, and he could hear faint whispers as if the wind carried the echoes of lost voices. Compelled by a force he couldn't explain, he took a step closer. "Who are you?" he asked gently, hoping to understand her plight. The woman's lips moved, but no sound escaped. Instead, she pointed to the tree, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Suddenly, the ground beneath my uncle's feet shifted, and he stumbled back. When he looked up again, the woman had vanished, leaving only the soft rustling of leaves behind. My uncle stood there, heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. Determined to uncover the truth, he returned the next day, armed with a notebook to jot down everything he could find. After speaking with some locals, he learned that the tree was indeed tied to a tragic story. Decades ago, a young woman had been in love with a local man. On the night they were supposed to elope, a terrible storm hit, and she was tragically struck by lightning while trying to reach him. With each story he heard, my uncle felt the weight of the woman's sorrow deepening. He realized that she was trapped between worlds, yearning for closure and peace. That evening, he returned to the oak tree, this time with a bouquet of wildflowers and a small candle. Kneeling at the base of the tree, he lit the candle and whispered a few words of remembrance, offering his respects to the lost soul. He placed the flowers gently at the foot of the tree, hoping to bring her some comfort. As he stood there, he felt a gentle breeze brush against him, as if the very air was thanking him for acknowledging her pain. The whispers he had heard before grew faint, replaced by a profound sense of calm. From that day on, my uncle visited the tree regularly, sharing stories with friends and family about the spirit he had encountered. He learned to respect the stories of the past and the power they held in shaping the present. Years later, as he recounted the tale to me, he said he felt that by honoring the woman's memory, he had helped her find peace. The ancient oak, once feared, became a symbol of love lost and the enduring connection between the living and the departed. My name is Sarah Thompson, and I work at a small bank in a quiet town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and gossip travels faster than the wind. One afternoon, while working the counter, I encountered something that still sends chills down my spine. It was just after lunch, and the bank was unusually quiet. Most of the customers had come in early to handle their transactions and grab lunch from the nearby cafe. I was organizing some paperwork when I noticed a woman walking toward the bathroom in the back of the bank. She had long, dark hair and wore a long gray coat that seemed a bit out of place for the season. I figured she was just another customer, but something about her felt off. After a few minutes, I noticed she hadn't returned. I shrugged it off at first, but as time passed, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. It wasn't like her to take so long. I decided to check on her, thinking she might need assistance. When I reached the bathroom door, I knocked lightly. "Ma'am, are you all right in there?" I called out, but there was no response. My instincts kicked in, and I turned the doorknob. To my surprise, it swung open easily. I stepped inside, but the bathroom was empty. The air felt heavy, and a chill ran down my spine. I glanced around, thinking she must have left through another exit, but that didn't explain why the room felt so eerie. As I was about to leave, I noticed something lying on the floor, a small leather passbook. I picked it up, thinking it might belong to the woman. It was worn and old, with yellowed pages and faded writing. Flipping through it, I saw entries dating back many years, mostly transactions of small amounts. The last entry caught my attention. It was dated just a few days prior and mentioned a large withdrawal. Curiosity piqued, I tucked the passbook under my arm and went back to my desk. I was determined to find out who it belonged to. After a few minutes of searching the bank's records, I found the name written in the passbook: Margaret Hill. Margaret was a name I recognized. She had been a longtime customer, a sweet old lady who always came in with a warm smile. But the last transaction in the passbook didn't match her usual patterns. I felt a sense of concern wash over me. Suddenly, the bank door swung open and a gust of wind blew in, making the lights flicker momentarily. I looked up to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway, looking frail but determined. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Margaret, I called out, holding up the passbook. The woman's expression changed, a mix of recognition and fear crossing her face. Where did you find that? She asked, stepping closer. I explained how I discovered the passbook in the bathroom and asked if she was all right. Her gaze darted nervously around the bank as if she were searching for something. I thought I lost it, she stammered. It's very important to me. I handed it to her, but she hesitated before taking it. Can I ask what happened? You seem to take a long time in the bathroom, I probed gently. Margaret glanced over her shoulder, her voice dropping to a whisper. I saw her, the woman in the bathroom. My heart raced. What do you mean? What woman? She's been following me for weeks now, Margaret replied, her voice trembling. Every time I go to the bank, I feel her presence. In the bathroom, I saw her reflection in the mirror. She was staring right at me. A chill ran down my spine. Are you sure it wasn't just your imagination? Margaret shook her head vigorously. No, it's real. She wants something from me, something that belongs to her. I tried to calm her down, but I could feel the tension in the air. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and I thought I saw a shadow dart past the entrance of the bank. Margaret, you need to leave. Maybe take a break from coming here for a while, I suggested, hoping to ease her fear. But she just looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and sadness. I can't, she whispered. I have to settle my account. It's all I have left. Before I could say anything else, she turned and rushed out of the bank, clutching the passbook tightly to her chest. I watched her go, a feeling of dread settling in my stomach. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I finished my shift. When I finally left the bank, I glanced back at the building, half expecting to see Margaret again. But the only thing that greeted me was the silence of the night. Weeks passed, and I didn't see Margaret again. I learned from my coworkers that she hadn't come in since that day. It wasn't until one fateful evening that I discovered why. The news spread quickly throughout the town. A tragic story of an elderly woman who had passed away alone in her home. When I heard the news, my heart sank. I remembered the fear in her eyes, the urgency in her voice. It all made sense now. But there was something else that nagged at me. The very next day, while cleaning up the back office, I found the passbook lying on my desk. It hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, I opened it to the last entry. It was different now. The numbers had changed, and beside the last transaction, I noticed a new date, the day Margaret passed away. I felt a chill sweep over me, and as I stared at the page, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's presence lingered, still searching for something that belonged to her, even in death. To this day, I can't explain what happened that afternoon in the bank, but I learned that sometimes the past doesn't let go so easily, and some spirits refuse to be forgotten. It was supposed to be a fun day. My family had taken a trip to Shadow Grove, a local amusement park known for its massive playground called the Labyrinth. It was a maze of colorful tunnels, slides, and plastic bridges, perfect for kids like my younger sister, Emily, who loved to explore. I, on the other hand, was less enthusiastic. At 12 years old, I was already too old for childish things like that. So while my parents settled on a bench and Emily ran off to play, I stayed nearby, idly watching. Hours passed, and I could see Emily darting through the tunnels, her laughter ringing out every now and then. But after a while, she vanished from sight. At first, no one thought much of it. It was a big playground, after all. But when she didn't come out after several minutes, the mood shifted. Some of the other kids went into the playground to look for her, but they came back empty-handed. That's when things got serious. My dad started shouting at one of the supervisors, demanding that they shut the place down and organize a search. Panic spread quickly among the adults. They started telling stories about an urban legend, a child who had once been abducted from the park, their head shaved, and smuggled out in a quick disguise. Someone suggested that maybe the same thing had happened to Emily. The police were called, and soon the park was swarming with officers combing through every inch of the playground. My parents were beside themselves with worry. I stayed quiet, feeling like I knew something no one else did. Emily wasn't taken by some stranger in the park. She was taken by the man I'd seen in my nightmares, the man who lived in the tunnels under Shadow Grove. I knew it, but who would believe me? When the police came up empty-handed, Shadow Grove closed its doors for good. A few days later, when investigators asked for surveillance footage, the park owner shamefully admitted that no cameras had ever been installed. The deeper they dug, the worse things got. It turned out the park had been operating with numerous safety violations. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was that Emily was still in there, somewhere. Whether or not she was alive was another question. While my parents were too consumed by grief to notice much of anything, I made a decision. I packed a flashlight and a pocket knife into my backpack and took a long bike ride back to Shadow Grove. My mission was simple: find Emily and bring her back. When I arrived, the park looked worse than I remembered. The rides stood rusting, the colorful plastic of the playground now faded and cracked. The place was eerily quiet. I circled the park until I found a door at the back, with a small wooden window above the handle. Without thinking, I grabbed a rock and smashed the glass. The security alarm didn't go off. It seemed the park's neglect extended to every corner. I slipped inside, moving cautiously through the empty halls until I reached the main playground. There it was, the labyrinth, now a ghost of its former self. The tubes and slides that had once been vibrant now looked like the skeletal remains of a giant, otherworldly beast. Only the dim light filtering through the windows cast a weak glow over the room. I approached one of the tunnels, standing at the entrance. It was pitch black inside. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam bouncing off the plastic surfaces. I was looking for something. Anything that would tell me where Emily had gone. But I didn't see her, or the man from my nightmares. I swallowed my fear and stepped inside the tunnel, the plastic creaking beneath me. With each step, I felt the weight of the silence grow. The only sound was my own breathing and the rapid thudding of my heart. My grip tightened around the handle of the knife in my pocket. Just as I was about to turn back, a soft sound echoed from the darkness ahead. A chuckle. A low, menacing laugh that sent a chill up my spine. I froze, every instinct telling me to run. But I couldn't leave. Not without Emily. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I climbed further into the tunnel, crawling through the darkness. I didn't know what I would find, but I was determined to find my sister, no matter what waited for me in the shadows. I crawled through the dark maze of tunnels, each twist and turn deepening my dread. The air grew thick and heavy, and I could feel the dampness creeping into my clothes. My flashlight flickered as I moved, casting eerie shadows on the plastic walls that seemed to close in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After what felt like hours of crawling, I stumbled upon a strange sight. Someone had burned a hole in the plastic wall of the tunnel, and it led into an adjacent space. My heart raced as I realized the implications. Someone had been here. Someone who might know where Emily was. Fueled by a mix of fear and determination, I climbed through the hole, ready to face whatever lay beyond. On the other side, I found myself in a small, concrete room. It was dim and musty, filled with the smell of decay. In one corner lay a dirty mattress, covered in tattered clothes that looked as though they had been discarded. Scattered newspapers and old envelopes littered the floor, and a few cans of beer and baked beans sat carelessly in the corner. I picked up a random envelope, its edges yellowed and frayed. It was addressed simply to someone named Mr. Robert Gray. No address, no sender information. A sickening thought crept into my mind. Someone had been living here. Was this Robert Gray the man from my nightmares? Was he connected to Emily's disappearance? With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper. My heart dropped as I read the message, seemingly written in blood. See, nothing to be afraid of. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there. As I turned to flee, I thought I heard something behind me. The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel, drawing closer. I spun around, my heart racing. In the darkness, two glowing orange eyes stared back at me, steadily gaining ground. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I scrambled back through the hole, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The laughter that had once filled the tunnels now turned into a frenzied pursuit. Whatever was behind me was definitely not human. I bolted deeper into the maze, my flashlight flickering wildly. In the distance, I saw the 4-story slide looming like a beacon of hope. Without thinking, I dove headfirst down the tunnel slide, closing my eyes and bracing for impact. I flew through the darkness, the wind rushing past me as I descended, waiting for the moment when I would hit the ground. Finally, I landed with a thud on solid ground. Ignoring the pain shooting through my body, I sprang to my feet and raced toward the exit. I could hear the sounds of shuffling footsteps behind me, but I refused to look back. I knew that if I slowed down, I might not escape. I didn't stop running until I was outside, hopping on my bike and pedaling furiously away from Shadow Grove. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see those haunting orange eyes following me. But I made it home safely, my heart pounding in my chest. My parents were still consumed by their grief, oblivious to my near-death experience. They didn't notice I had almost become another victim that day. I kept my encounter at Shadow Grove to myself, knowing no one would believe me. I was just a kid with a vivid imagination, shaped by the trauma of Emily's disappearance. As the years passed, I kept tabs on that old building. Shadow Grove was reborn as a teppanyaki restaurant, but tragedy struck again when a chef poisoned several guests, killing 8. It then became a house of worship, where a fire broke out during a service claiming the lives of 14 people. Now it stands as a daycare center for children. So far, there have been no incidents, but I knew better. There was always a reason to be afraid. As I lay in bed at night, I could still hear that laughter echoing through the darkness, a chilling reminder of the secrets that lurked beneath the surface of Shadow Grove. And somewhere in the depths of that forgotten playground, I knew Emily was still waiting for me to find her. Years passed since that harrowing day at Shadow Grove, and while my childhood nightmares had faded into distant memories, the haunting knowledge that my sister might still be trapped in the shadows never truly left me. Each year, on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, an unsettling feeling crept into my heart, urging me to return to that cursed playground. Now in my 20s, I had spent years trying to forget what happened that day. I went to college, made friends, and even started a promising career. Yet something always pulled me back. On the 5th anniversary of Emily's vanishing, I finally made the decision to confront my past. As I drove towards Shadow Grove, I felt a mix of apprehension and determination. The once familiar landscape had changed over the years, but the memories of laughter and innocence clung to the air. The buildings around the old playground had been revitalized, bustling with life, but that life felt distant from the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. When I arrived, the daycare center looked inviting, a far cry from the nightmarish visions etched in my mind. Children played joyfully, their laughter echoing through the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was time to uncover the truth. I parked my car and approached the entrance. A woman in her 30s greeted me, her smile warm and genuine. "Welcome. Are you here for a tour?" "Actually, I used to come here as a kid," I replied, swallowing the knot in my throat. "I wanted to see how it's changed." Her expression softened with understanding. "It's great to see someone with fond memories of this place. Please, feel free to look around." I wandered through the colorful rooms filled with toys and laughter, but the further I moved from the entrance, the more my heart raced. The energy felt different in the back halls where I had crawled through those dark tunnels. My footsteps echoed unnervingly as I approached the area that led to the old playground. The plastic structure was still there, now coated in bright paint and adorned with cheerful designs. However, beneath the cheerful exterior, I could sense the remnants of its sinister past. Memories flooded my mind, my sister's laughter, the chilling darkness, and the shadow that had haunted my dreams. I approached the entrance to the tunnel slide, feeling an inexplicable pull. Despite the cheerful colors, dread gnawed at me. What if I was right? What if Emily was still trapped somewhere inside? I couldn't ignore the urge any longer. I had to find out. "Excuse me," I called to the woman who had welcomed me. "Is it okay if I go inside the playground?" "Of course, just be careful and don't go too far." Her voice faded behind me as I slipped into the familiar darkness. The play area was transformed, but the tunnel still bore a haunting resemblance to the one I had crawled through as a child. As I stepped inside, memories washed over me, and the air felt thick with something unnameable. Armed with my flashlight, I took a deep breath and ventured into the dark, twisting tunnels. Each turn reminded me of the fear I had felt years ago. Was I brave or foolish for returning? I could feel the weight of my decision pressing down on me. As I crawled deeper, the laughter of the children faded away, leaving only silence and the sound of my own breath. I knew I shouldn't be here, yet the desire to find answers overpowered my fear. I had to uncover the truth about what happened to Emily, even if it meant facing the very darkness that had consumed my childhood. Suddenly, I stumbled upon the charred remains of the burned hole that had led into the adjacent space. My heart raced as I recalled the horrors I had witnessed years ago. I crawled through, my flashlight flickering against the damp walls. The heavy, musty smell enveloped me, and I steeled myself for whatever lay ahead. In the dim light, I noticed something, a glimmer of color against the dull concrete floor. I leaned closer and gasped. There, partially buried under debris, was a faded red dress, Emily's dress, the same one she had been wearing the day she disappeared. Panic surged through me as I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the fabric. "Emily!" I whispered, hope igniting within me. "Are you here?" But all that responded was silence. I felt the walls of the tunnel close in around me, and a creeping dread gripped my heart. What had happened in this place? What darkness had taken hold of my sister? Determined to find the answers, I pressed forward, deeper into the shadows of Shadow Grove, unaware of the malevolent presence watching me from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. The air grew heavier as I moved deeper into the tunnels of Shadow Grove, the dim beam of my flashlight flickering against the damp walls. The faded red dress clutched in my hand felt like a lifeline, tethering me to my sister. As I pressed forward, the memories of that day came rushing back. Her laughter, her small hand in mine, the innocent joy before everything turned dark. I ventured through the maze of tunnels, each turn revealing more remnants of a forgotten past. Old toys lay scattered, broken and dusty, like lost hopes abandoned in a cruel game. The deeper I crawled, the more I sensed that I wasn't alone. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, teasing me with glimpses of movement just beyond the reach of my light. "Emily?" I called again, desperation creeping into my voice. "Are you there?" Silence answered, heavy and suffocating. My heart raced, urging me to keep going, despite the growing dread. Then, from somewhere deeper within the labyrinth, I heard a soft sound, a faint, childlike giggle. My heart skipped a beat. "Emily!" I shouted, hope surging through me. "I'm coming!" I followed the sound, scrambling through the narrow tunnels, the walls seeming to close in on me. As I turned a corner, I stumbled into a small, dimly lit room, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. In the corner lay a dirty mattress, the fabric stained and tattered, surrounded by empty cans and scattered newspapers. But it was the sight of a small figure in the shadows that stole my breath away. "Emily?" I whispered, stepping closer. The figure turned, revealing a girl with matted hair and hollow eyes, her skin pale as if drained of life. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm your brother," I exclaimed, rushing forward. "I've been looking for you. We have to get out of here." But as I reached out to touch her, she recoiled, the shadows in the room shifting as if they were alive. "No. You can't leave. He'll come for you." "Who?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "Who will come?" She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The man in the tunnels. He's waiting for you." My heart dropped. The man from my dreams, the one who had haunted my childhood. "But he can't hurt you anymore. I'm here to save you." Emily's eyes darted around the room, fear etched on her face. "You don't understand. He takes children. He took me. He doesn't want us to leave." A chill ran down my spine as I recalled the stories I had heard about the playground's dark history. The rumors of children disappearing, whispers of an abductor lurking in the shadows. Had I stumbled into the lair of a monster? Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the darkness beyond the room. My blood ran cold as the shadows deepened, coalescing into a figure cloaked in darkness. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed, the voice raspy and filled with malice. I turned to run, but Emily grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "We have to hide!" We scrambled to the far side of the room, crouching behind the mattress as the darkness swirled closer. I could hear its heavy breaths, feel the malevolence radiating from it. "You're too late," it whispered, echoing my worst fears. "She is mine." "Run," I shouted, adrenaline surging through my veins as I pulled Emily to her feet. We dashed towards the exit, but the darkness lunged at us, its claws reaching out from the shadows. "Keep going," I urged, my heart pounding as I pushed Emily ahead of me. We scrambled through the tunnels, the growls of the creature echoing behind us. The walls felt like they were closing in, but I couldn't stop. I had to save her. As we neared the end of the tunnel, a bright light pierced the darkness. I pushed Emily ahead of me, my heart racing. "Get to the exit! I'll hold it off!" "No," she cried, but I didn't give her a choice. I sprinted toward the light, glancing back just as the creature lunged. "Go!" I yelled, launching myself toward the exit as I felt its claws swipe at my back. The world burst into blinding light as I stumbled out into the daylight. I turned, ready to fight, but the shadows receded as the sunlight flooded the entrance. The creature shrieked, a sound that rattled my bones, and then it vanished into the depths of the tunnel, retreating from the light. "Emily!" I cried, frantically searching for her. I saw her standing at the entrance, her eyes wide with fear. "Come on!" With a burst of courage, she dashed toward me, and I scooped her up, holding her tight as we both collapsed on the grass outside Shadow Grove. The sun felt warm against my skin, a stark contrast to the cold darkness we had escaped. "Are we safe?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," I replied, my heart still racing, "but we have to leave before it comes back." Together, we ran towards my car, the echoes of our escape lingering in the air behind us. As I drove away from Shadow Grove, I glanced back at the playground, knowing I would never forget what we had faced there. But deep down, I understood that the darkness wouldn't be so easily forgotten. The man in the tunnels was still out there, waiting for the next chance to claim another innocent soul. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.